The moment Nadia pressed send on that email, her hands were shaking so badly she nearly knocked over the wine glass sitting on the edge of Maru's desk. 300 pages of classified internal files, confidential acquisition targets, boardroom strategies that men had killed careers to keep secret. Gone. Delivered straight into the hands of the very people who had paid her to steal them. She thought she would feel relief. She thought she would feel powerful. She thought this moment, the moment she finally finished the job, would feel like winning. But Maru was standing in the doorway behind her, and he was not angry. He was not shocked. He was not scrambling for his phone to call security. He was just standing there, hands in his pockets, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and he was smiling. Not the warm smile she had fallen in love with over long nights in this very office. This smile was different. This smile was old. And in a voice so calm it made her blood run cold, he said 7 words that collapsed her entire world. "I've been waiting for you to do that. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes." 6 months earlier, Nadia was broke, desperate, and sitting in the back of a black car she definitely could not afford, speeding toward a meeting that would change her life in ways she could not begin to predict. She was 28 years old, smart, fluent in Korean after years of studying international business, a communications degree from a university nobody had heard of, and a very short resume. She had been working as a translator for a mid-level consulting firm when the call came from a private number. The voice on the other end was American, male, polished in the way that only men with very old money manage to sound polished. His name, she would later learn, was Director Yoon, though he was about as Korean as a golf course in Connecticut. He ran a shell company backed by a consortium of investors who had one singular goal: to destroy Maru Kang's empire before his company went public. The offer was simple: get close to Maru, get hired at his company, Kang Tech Industries, a fintech and biotech hybrid that was 6 weeks away from the most anticipated IPO in Seoul in a decade. Get access to his files, his contacts, his acquisition strategy, and deliver everything to Yoon before the IPO date. In exchange, $250,000, and the clearing of a debt she had been carrying since her father's medical bills arrived after his stroke 2 years ago, a debt that had turned her life into a slow suffocation. Nadia said yes before the car even stopped. She walked into the Kang Tech Industries headquarters building on a Tuesday morning with a fabricated resume, 3 fake references, and a strategy she had rehearsed for 4 days straight. She was applying for the position of Senior Communications and Translation Liaison, a newly posted role that required exactly the skills she genuinely had. She sailed through 2 rounds of interviews. She was sharp, composed. She had done her homework. She knew the company's public-facing financials, their press history, their expansion timeline. The hearing panel was impressed. And then she met Maru. He walked into the 3rd interview room 20 minutes late, still on the phone, with the kind of energy that quietly announces itself before it enters the room. He was not what she expected. She had prepared for a cold, distant chaebol air, one of those untouchable Korean business princes who spoke in press releases and looked through employees like glass. But Maru sat down across from her, ended his call, and spent the next 45 minutes asking her real questions. Not the rehearsed HR kind. Real questions. What did she think of Kang Tech's Southeast Asia rollout strategy? Where did she think the gap was between their English-language press releases and the way their actual story read to Western investors? What would she change if she could? Nadia answered honestly, and for a moment, just a moment, she forgot she was lying about everything else. He hired her on the spot. The first 3 weeks were pure intelligence work. She was careful. She was methodical. She cataloged everything: internal communications, meeting schedules, who had access to which servers, which assistants were careless about leaving screens unlocked, which executives drank too much at company dinners and talked too freely. She sent Director Yoon weekly reports, always encrypted, always from a burner device she kept wrapped in a sock at the bottom of her gym bag. The reports were detailed, professional, and completely emotionless. That was week 1 through 3. Week 4 was when everything started to fracture. It started with a late night. There was a crisis, a leak in their pre-IPO disclosure documents, something that had nothing to do with Nadia, something that happened before she even arrived. The entire communications team was in the office until 2 in the morning. And when the last wave of panic finally settled, Maru appeared in the bullpen with takeout containers from a 24-hour place around the corner. And he sat on the edge of a desk and ate rice with his team like a man who genuinely did not see a difference between himself and the people who worked for him. Nadia had been around powerful men her entire career. She had watched them perform humility. This was not that. He noticed her still at her desk. He brought her a container without being asked. He said simply that she had handled the translation crisis beautifully that evening and that he was glad she was there. She went home that night and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. Over the weeks that followed, she began to understand why people who worked for Maru Kang were fiercely loyal to him in ways that could not be manufactured by a good salary alone. He remembered details. He followed up on problems people mentioned in passing. When one of the junior analysts in her team had a sick mother, Maru quietly arranged for the team's schedule to be adjusted without making it into a moment of public generosity. When Nadia flagged a strategic communications error in their English investor materials, an error that was not her problem to catch, that fell outside her official role, he not only fixed it immediately, but credited her publicly in the next all-hands meeting. He was relentless and demanding, and he set a pace that could be brutal. But he was also, underneath all of it, decent. And decency, Nadia was discovering, was the thing she had been hungry for her entire professional life without ever nomming it. The shift happened on a night in late November when they were both in the office long after everyone else had gone home. Him preparing for an investor call with New York, her translating a set of materials for a Singapore partnership. She brought him coffee without thinking about it. He looked up and said thank you in the way people say thank you when they actually mean it. And somehow, they ended up talking for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Kang Tech. He talked about his father, who had built the original company and then lost it to a boardroom coup when Maru was 19. He talked about what it had taken to rebuild it from nothing over the decade that followed. He talked with a rawness she had not expected, and she sat there absorbing every word and feeling like the worst person alive. Because she was falling in love with him, and she was going to destroy him, and she did not know how to stop either thing from happening. Director Yoon called the next morning. His voice had lost its pleasantness. The IPO date was being moved up by 2 weeks. He needed the acquisition target list, the complete list of companies Maru was planning to purchase immediately after going public, before competitors could act on the information. Without that list, the entire operation had no teeth. Nadia had 3 weeks. Get the files, or she would not see a cent of the money. And the debt collectors, who had been temporarily quieted by Yoon's network, would become very loud again. She said she understood. She hung up. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 20 minutes, her forehead against the steering wheel. Then she went back inside and did her job. The acquisition files were kept on a private server that only Maru and his head of corporate strategy had direct access to. But Nadia had spent 2 months building the kind of trust that makes people careless. His EA had started leaving her logged into the executive system when she stepped out for coffee. The head of strategy had begun to loop Nadia into communications that technically required higher clearance, simply because her translations were faster and better than the official process. Access, Nadia understood, was not about hacking firewalls. It was about becoming the kind of person people stopped thinking to protect themselves from. She picked a Thursday evening. Everyone left by 7. She told the security desk she had forgotten something and badged back in at 8:15. She went to Maru's office. She used a temporary access window she had identified in the system 3 weeks earlier. She found the files, and she sat at his desk, his chair, his office, surrounded by the faint trace of his presence, and she began to copy everything to an encrypted drive. And then she made the mistake of reading them. The acquisition list was not what Director Yoon had described. Maru was not buying competitors to bury them. He was building a network of struggling mid-size healthcare tech companies across Southeast Asia, companies that served rural communities that were underfunded and under-resourced. The strategy was not predatory. It was something else entirely. Something that looked, unmistakably, like the mission of a man who had watched his own father's company get devoured, and had decided that the only way to use power responsibly was to spend it protecting people who had none. Nadia sat very still for a long time. Then she sent the files to Yoon anyway. Because $250,000, because her father's debt, because she had made a promise before she understood who she was making it against. Because by the time you understand what a mistake truly costs, you have already paid. She pressed send. She heard the door open behind her. And there was Maru, in the doorway, looking at her with that terrible calm, that old smile, those 7 words that dismantled every version of events she had built in her head. "I've been waiting for you to do that." He walked into the office. He sat down in the chair across from his own desk, the chair that guests sat in, the chair that put her in the position of power, and he looked at her steadily and began to speak. He had known from the second week, not suspected. Known. One of Yoon's lower-level operatives had made contact 6 months ago through a different channel, and Maru's security team had been tracking the consortium's movements ever since. When Nadia walked into that interview room, his people had already run a quiet background check and found the discrepancies in her references. He hired her anyway. He needed someone to find out who exactly was feeding Yoon information from inside his own board, and a plant from the outside. Someone Yoon trusted, someone he was actively communicating with, was the most direct line to that answer. The files she had just sent, they were real, but they were incomplete. The real acquisition strategy, the documents that actually mattered, were on a separate server that Nadia had never come close to accessing. What she had just handed Yoon was a carefully constructed decoy, detailed enough to be credible, misleading enough to be catastrophic for anyone who tried to act on it. Maru had used her, exactly the way she had been using him. But here is where the story adds a second cut, because as Maru explained all of this to Nadia in that quiet office, something in his delivery began to shift. The strategic composure started to let something else through, and Nadia, who had spent months studying his face for information, saw what it was. He had not anticipated falling for her either. He told her this in the same direct, unvarnished way he told her everything, not as a performance, not as a manipulation, but simply as a fact he was no longer willing to withhold. He had started this exercise as intelligence work. It had become something else. The night they talked for 3 hours, the coffee she brought without being asked, the way she had quietly protected his people in rooms where she thought no one was watching her, he had been watching. And something in him had changed. The question, he said, was what she wanted to do with that information. Nadia looked at this man who had outwitted her, who could have had her arrested, who had every reason in the world to despise her. And she made a decision that was not about money, and was not about fear, and was not about anyone's strategy except her own. She told him everything, not just about the files, about Yoon's consortium, about the board member who had been feeding them information for 18 months before she ever arrived, a name she had learned through her access to internal communications, a name she had buried in her reports to Yoon because she was not sure what to do with it. She gave Maru everything she had. Every contact, every encrypted channel, every detail of the operation she had been part of. Because some decisions are not about survival, they are about who you can stand to be. 3 days later, the consortium made its move. They released Nadia's files, the decoy files, to a financial news outlet, attempting to tank Kang Tech's IPO valuation by leaking what they believed was sensitive strategic intelligence. The story ran on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Maru's legal team had issued a comprehensive rebuttal, demonstrating in precise detail exactly why the leaked documents were incomplete, manipulated, and in 3 specific instances, factually impossible given Kang Tech's verified public filings. The attempted sabotage became, instead, proof that a rival consortium had been engaged in a coordinated corporate espionage campaign against a company days away from its IPO. The story flipped entirely. The board member who had been feeding Yoon information for 18 months resigned before the weekend was over. Director Yoon's shell company began facing regulatory scrutiny that would take 2 years and a great deal of money to survive. The consortium did not get what they came for. Kang Tech went public on the scheduled date. It was the second largest tech IPO in South Korea that year. Nadia did not get the $250,000. She walked out of the building that Thursday night and did not come back the next day. She sat in her apartment and waited for consequences she believed she deserved. She had breached every ethical line she could name. The fact that the files were fake did not change the fact that she had stolen them and sent them to people who wanted to destroy someone she had come to love. She had no job. She had her debt. She had the memory of a man who had looked at her in a dark office and told her the truth when he had no obligation to. 2 weeks after the IPO, Maru appeared at her door. He did not call first. He was carrying 2 coffees from a place she had mentioned once, in passing, on a night when she was not trying to remember every detail for a report. He had not come to offer her a job. He had not come with a proposition or a strategy or a clever arrangement that served both their interests. He had come because a man who had spent 10 years rebuilding something from nothing had learned, better than most, the difference between things that were salvageable and things that were not. He believed she was the former. Nadia was not naive enough to believe that love was simple after this. That trust could be rebuilt in an afternoon over 2 cups of coffee. That the things they had done to each other simply dissolved because both of them had wanted something real underneath the deception. None of that was how it worked. She knew that. But she took the coffee, and she let him in, and they sat at her small kitchen table and talked honestly, slowly, without strategy for the first time. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about spies or IPOs or corporate sabotage, though it is all of those things. It is about the terrifying moment when you realize that the walls you built to survive have become the walls that are keeping you from living. Nadia built hers out of desperation and loyalty to a father who was sick and a debt that was suffocating her. Maru built his out of grief and loss and a decade of fighting alone. Both of them had become very good at using people while wanting, more than anything, to be known. They had both tried to use each other, and somewhere in the middle of all that calculated deception, something accidental and irreversible had happened. Neither of them had a word for it yet, but they had coffee and a small kitchen, and the same rare understanding that most people spend their whole lives looking for, that the other person in the room had also been pretending to be less than they were, and was ready, finally, to stop. Sometimes the most dangerous mission is not the one you were assigned. It is the one you did not plan for, the one that costs you every wall you ever built, the one you survive with nothing left but the truth. And occasionally, not always, but occasionally, the truth is enough. And that is where we leave Nadia and Maru, 2 people who walked into each other's lives as instruments of destruction, and walked out of it with something neither of them was sent to find. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, if you felt that knot in your chest somewhere between the moment she pressed send and the moment he appeared at her door, then you already know what kind of person you are. You root for the ones who are trying, even when they are failing. You believe in the possibility of people. That says everything about you, and I am glad you are here. Now, before you go, drop a comment and tell me, who did you think was more guilty? Nadia, who sold her loyalty for survival, or Maru, who let her fall in love with him while he was running an operation? There is no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story is the kind of content you want more of, betrayal, revenge, dark romance, people doing terrible things for complicated reasons, hit subscribe, because this channel runs deep on exactly that. And smash the like button, because the algorithm does not care about your feelings, but it does care about that. I will see you in the next one. Do not trust anyone in it.